Hey everyone, it's Thor. I just wanted to do a really quick tutorial to show how to use washes correctly. It's a really simple thing to do, but a lot of people make a few common mistakes, so that's what I wanted to show. So I've base coated this model with brown, and what I'll show is a brown wash over this. So what I like to do before I do washes, and should be able to see it pretty well, is I base coat it and I highlight it first. So I like to do that so that when I do the wash, it's done. The other advantage is when you go ahead and do the layering first before the wash will blend some of your layers together, so it'll create like a nice smooth transition and stuff. So it's really good for that as well. And of course it's great for shading. So you can see the highlights I put on here. I went a little bright because I know that I'm going to come in with this dark wash and everything's going to get darker. So the big thing with washes is when you're washing your miniature, you need to pull the wash towards the folds. So there's folds here that you can see. So when I wash this area, I'm going to pull it and let it drop into the recesses. The other thing you want to do in general with that is to pull it towards the areas that need the shading. So when I wash back here, it should be darker underneath, darker here. So what I'm going to do is pull the washes up into these areas. What you need to do is to pull the wash towards the area that needs the most shading. So wherever you start, the brush is going to have the least amount, as long as you don't completely soak your brush. And when you pull it to an area, that's where it's going to deposit. So that's really the big trick, is to just kind of push it into the areas that really need the shading. So with that being said, what I'm going to do is take my Agrax Earthshade and start applying it to the model. So I'm using a relatively big brush. This is a size 2. You can really use any brush. I just like larger size brushes because you can get more wash on here. And you can go as liberal as you want. Some people really like to hose their miniature in it, and that's kind of what I'm going to do here, just to really to demonstrate. And honestly, I just like the strong contrast it gives. So what I like to do is to start at the top and work down. So I'm going to start up here at the neck, applied the wash here, and then just kind of work around and do the same thing. So like I said, I'm pushing it into the folds here because that's where I want it to rest. And then I'm going to move on to other areas. And again, kind of following that principle of starting up high and working down low. You can do this however you want, it's just my preference. And same thing with the shoulder, because we want some shading underneath the shoulder. So what I'm going to do is get a little more extra wash on my brush and just kind of fill that area up so it'll create a shadow underneath it. And as far as your brush, just to show, this is about as loaded as I go. You can go more, but this gives you more control over it. And really the big thing with washes is to have that control so you can get the wash deposited where it needs to be, and it doesn't create pooling in areas it shouldn't be. So again, I'm kind of pulling it towards the areas that need the most shading and letting it deposit. So now come into the front of the uniform, and you can see I'm pulling it to the recess, and it creates that pool there, and that's going to create our shading. So as I was saying earlier, I'm going to pull it up to get the deposit underneath here, to get some shading here. When I work this area, I kind of work the line to create depth in the recess there. And then I'm just going to go over this a little bit to try to get some into these little folds here. They're not very deep, so they're not going to collect a lot, and that's fine. So that's basically that, as simple as that was. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'm going to let this dry, and then I'll come back once that's dry to show you the result. So this isn't quite dry yet. If you look, you can see there's still some wet spots, but as this was drying I noticed something. So if I turn this over, you can see I've got a lot of pooling here. So the wash I pushed up here came down and went into this area, and that's more than I want there. So what I'm going to do to fix this is take a brush that's a little damp and then come in here and kind of smooth it out and pull it out a bit. So I want a pretty good shadow here, but not as much. So I just took the brush, it was a little damp, came in. I know it's kind of reflecting, so it's hard to catch, and then pulled it down. The trick is to have your brush damp, because water catches water basically, which is pretty much what a wash is. So you need something wet. If you were to use a dry brush, it's not going to have the effect. What you'll do is you'll kind of pull it all away. So with the damp brush, I just came in and just kind of pulled it away, and then as you can see, that's reduced the amount and got rid of that pooling. So that's one thing you do have to do, you have to keep an eye on, is the pooling, because once you set it down, it will start to, gravity will do its thing and pull the wash into spots you may not necessarily want it. The rest of this looks pretty good, so I'm going to leave that, let this to continue to dry, and then come back and show you all what we've got. So the wash is now fully dry. It came out pretty well. You can see some of the really darker areas that I wanted in here, and overall it came out pretty well. There's no excessive pooling, there's no weird spots or anything like that, which can happen with a wash if you're not applying it correctly. And for the most part it's pretty much done. However, there's a few spots that I do want to fix. So what I'm going to do is use a smaller brush and take a wash and just hit the areas that I feel need a little more shading. So up in here, I did not get it as thick as I really wanted. So just kind of carefully take the wash and just brush it into those spots that you want to enhance. There's no need to do a whole second layer for it when you can just do this, and if you do it carefully, it works out very well. So that, I feel like there needs to be a little more back here. Excuse me, losing my voice. And then I wanted to enhance the shading underneath the carapace here. I didn't feel that got enough, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to touch these spots here. Let's see, I'm going to add a little more of a shadow under the shoulder. Do the same for the other side. And that's it. The rest I feel looks good. So I'm going to let that dry and call that good. And I will come back when that's all set. Alright, so the model's all done. So I'll show you what the final result is here. So you can see the nice shading in here. Let's see if I can get this to focus. Shading here. You can see the highlights stayed. They toned down to kind of match what the wash I did, which is exactly what I wanted. You can still see the highlights up here. You can see that added shading I put in there to give it a little more depth. Overall, I'd say it's pretty good. For something tabletop, I'd be perfectly happy with this. And that's exactly what I wanted to show. I suppose I probably could get a little darker in here, but you know, for the sake of this tutorial, we'll leave it like this. This model is just for the sake of doing this, so there's no need to get too perfect with it. But that's really all there is. So again, where I was just doing this for a tutorial, I didn't have everything to wash. If I were painting this for the table, you know, I'd have the pants, I'd have the boots. I would try to wash as much of this as I can because it's such a nice and quick process. And it's perfect for something like Imperial Guard where you've got to paint a million of them. So a little tip I have is when you have a lot of areas you need to wash, even if you're going to wash it in the same color, say I did these pants in the same brown, when it comes to washing, do it in stages. So it's tempting to just wash all of the brown layers at once. The problem with that is, like the pooling I had on earlier I showed with this, it's going to happen everywhere. So then you have to come in and take a look at every model, and it's even worse when you're doing a whole thing because the wash from up here could run down to the pants and really mess up the lower layers because you're setting the model down like this, gravity's going to pull it down. So I like to work in layers. So even if I were doing the pants and the jacket, I would do the jacket, let that dry. When that's done, come in, do the pants, let that dry. If I were going to do the boots, I would then do the boots, let that dry. It just gives you a much better result than trying to do it all at once. It winds up looking sloppy, and it's tricky to get right. You can do it if you have the time to kind of monitor it and make sure everything's not pooling excessively and stuff. So that pretty much covers washes. The other thing I did want to mention though is large surfaces. Washes are great for things like this, things with a lot of ridges, things that are organic, things like that. If you're doing a tank, washes are not what you're going to want to use on those large flat surfaces. I've done it in the past with models when I was learning to paint, and it just looks terrible. No matter how careful you are on a large flat surface, it's going to pool, it's going to be uneven, it's just never going to look right. So keep the washes for smaller things like this, things that have a lot of detail where the pooling and stuff is going to sit in and everything's going to even out. But don't do it on tanks and things like that. It just isn't going to work, and there's really no good way to do that, not with a wash anyway. You can pull things off with glazes, but that's a whole other thing. So I think that's going to wrap up what I was trying to accomplish here with this video. I hope you liked it. If you haven't, please subscribe. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll catch you all later.